This again. Hi, I'm Jonathan Albin. This is NycosRPG, and this is a Game Master's Rant. I have 10 points I want to go over pretty quickly. Kind of my release of the energy of the universe over the last few weeks, and these are things that happen in my games now or have happened in my games in the past that have set me off in particular, and I want to just kind of refresh them because I've been having similar experiences in my games groups, and I'm trying to deal with them all in a sensible way. So before we get started, make sure you go down below and click all the buttons so that the algorithm knows you're part of our audience, and let's go at it.
Absorbing damage is the name of the game. From the claws of monsters or the heat from a ball of flame, our strength in numbers is a roll of the dice.
Well, I don't know whether the sound went out on that, and we may be clipping that here in a moment, but we'll see. This is, as I said, a Game Master's Rant. I'm going to be going over 10 troubling tendencies I'm seeing at my table, and you might be seeing at yours. And these are not situations that are manufactured or created for the purpose of creating content. It's actually things that we're facing on a daily basis. So I'm going to be asking you as well to enter into this kind of like a conversation. When I bring up a topic or whatever, if you have your resolution, why don't you share that with us, put it in the comments below, so we can have a great conversation about how to handle these difficulties in our games groups. So the first thing right off the top is something that I've noticed over the last couple of decades. It's increasing in intensity and frustrating me to no end, and that's the concept of players and game masters talking over one another. This happens generally when there is a disagreement, something that is not clear and needs some form of elucidation from one side or the other. And generally, it ends up being just a mess, a cacophonous noise that makes it almost impossible to handle. And I don't know when it was culturally that this happened. I do remember when I was a young man, if I go back and take out my teeth and talk about back in the olden days, people took turns speaking. They actually would wait until they heard what the other person said, consider the outcomes of what they had been offered, and then respond. And while maybe it wasn't a perfect system, and maybe there were people that were silenced by this seeming need for coherency, but the alternative is just noise. It makes it difficult to hear one another. In one of my previous careers as an air traffic controller, the microphone of the air traffic facilities was given priority, and in particular, the watch supervisor could actually override anyone in position so that a cooler head could prevail if things went sideways, or if there was some question. There was always an authority that could step in and stop the nonsense. And while that's not necessarily always a good thing, you certainly can have a tyrant as a game master or a tyrant as a table director. Nonetheless, the idea of having each person at least speak in turn tends to give better communication overall and avoid the noise level. Now, I don't know how you handle it at your table, but that's fundamentally what we've had to come down to, is that I will actually raise my hand while everyone is talking to draw attention back to the fact that we're out of order, and then try to re-establish an order of communication. Who's next, who's next, who's next. And that seems to help somewhat, but it's just a problem that it is culturally a norm, it seems, to shout out an answer over the top of everybody else. The next, I've talked about this before, and I did earlier today, but the microphones weren't working properly. But the idea of rolling just to roll dice is problematic. You see it all the time. You're at a table with a group of people, and one person just starts rolling dice, and they'll roll for 2 or 3 or 4 minutes, and then suddenly they'll stop. And then a conversation will go on. It'll turn back to their action, and they will declare their die roll, as their final one, which of course they rolled 3 minutes ago, to get to the right result that they wanted. And rolling just to roll is, I guess you consider, a superstitious nonsense, because it doesn't matter when the dice roll occurs. The concept of multiple die rolls to get to the conclusion that you desire, however, is a problem, because it seems to present the idea that you can never fail. I had one young player who incessantly was rolling 13s, 15s, 18s all the time, never rolled below a 12 on a bet. They couldn't roll below a 12. And the issue wasn't that they couldn't, it was that they wouldn't announce the 12s. They would roll, and then they would all of a sudden stop and use that die roll that had been the successful one. And this actually is circumventing the very purpose of the random number generation in a roleplay game. The idea is to create the air of mystery, the air of uncertainty, so that all the players at the table feel that same nuance of, will it work or will it won't? And, so to speak, the idea of rolling just to roll is itself problematic for that reason. At our table, what we actually have done is set it up so that each die roll is done in the open. That is to say, at least one other person has to see the dice roll, and generally the dice rolls follow a request for it from the game master. There's really not much reason for a player to be declaring that a dice roll should happen if the game master is running the table. And I know when we get in trouble, there are going to be people who disagree with me on that, and that's okay, because I'd like to hear from you. Why is it that rolling just to roll is not a challenge to you? And does a person have the right to constantly and always succeed? If they do, then what's the point of die rolling at all for anybody else? Because that person is not being held to the same standard. Of course, the next, I remember where my camera is, there it is. The next are unreadable dice. And God love them, the people who manufacture dice, I swear, endeavor to create dice that are functionally unreadable for two reasons. Number one is they tend to be very beautiful. They tend to be ornate, very filigree oriented, and yet the numbers are nigh unto impossible to discern from their faces. And in a role-playing game where the buildup of action is based on die rolling, it is recommended that you use readable dice so that others can verify values more rapidly. If you're using dice that are nearly indecipherable, it can take too long and actually suspend the disbelief that the table has actually accepted in the storytelling. And we should therefore find dice that are easy to be accessed by anybody else at the table. All right, the next, of course, would be a tutorial tone. Now, I get the idea that a veteran player can get frustrated with a new person. I get that a person who has additional information on a subject might want to offer additional information. But when I speak of the tutorial tone, I'm referring to the almost, what's the word I'm looking for? Patronistic tone. The idea of somehow I'm a veteran player and therefore know more than you, and almost like a talking down to. That needs to stop. And this doesn't necessarily come always from your veteran player. It might come from somebody who has a specialty that is invoked during the game conversation. But generally, the tone is usually accompanied with an air of authority. And this is problematic because it tends to undercut the confidence of the newer player and makes them question whether or not they have, that they're playing the right game. And that's, of course, problematic for me as a storyteller. And so it really bugs me when a player takes on this patronizing or tutorial tone. We need to find ways to move past that. How does your table handle someone who is doing this? Generally, it's merely a situation of moving on and moving past the difficult point, but it does also play into the idea that the players are at a shared table and that everyone should be enjoying themselves, and one player's opinion shouldn't overlay the others at the table. Next is the idea of player negation, and it's akin to the previous one, and this generally results from a player or multiple players who know the story well and are following along and have a lot of investment in the story, and when another player reacts and responds and gives an opinion that is contrary to that which the group holds, the player is countered. Now, this can happen in a lot of different ways. We'll be talking here in a little bit about PvP, but there are times when one player just simply tells another player they were wrong or they shouldn't have done thus and such. And this need to negate a player you disagree with is a problem and needs to be curtailed. How does your table handle when one player is completely focused on a different agenda than the rest? How do you handle that when it comes to group decisions and whether or not the individuals can actually play together? It becomes problematic. Another big challenge, especially to a large games group, is a player who literally is not paying attention. And I do have to address that there are some people who come to a game session after a long day at work and they are particularly exhausted and they are fighting to stay with the group and fighting to stay awake. And I'm not referring to these people because those are at least endeavoring to be there and be part of the action. What I'm referring to, of course, are instead those that literally come to the table and then immediately plug into their phone or tablet or whatever, and whenever it's their action turn, players have to remind them what's going on, remind them where they are, and they literally are breaking the rhythm of the game with their lack of attention to the game at hand. My play mechanism is that we are collaboratively playing, so even if you're not in the scene, you are at least in part responsible for helping the other players keep a hold of that which they've gathered in those scenes. And so I do permit a note taking, for example, within another player's turn, so that you can sort of act as their conscience or memory when it comes to coming to information that they got from that interaction. Because often the player won't even necessarily directly remember, and it'll be up to the other players to remind them. And that's essential to play. And so therefore a player who is being inattentive is actually doing a disservice not only to his own character, but to the story at large. Another issue, of course, is rules farming. And while NycosRPG doesn't suffer from that too much, because after all, I wrote the books, therefore there are no other resources to which a player might appeal. This is perhaps talking about previous game sessions where players will not agree with a decision that the game master has made and therefore look for another rules mechanism that countermands the decisions that were made and then try to find a way to make those rules apply. I call this rules farming. It's a deeper version perhaps than a rules lawyer, because a rules lawyer just wants to make sure that the game follows the rules as agreed to. But in the case of rules farming, you're looking for a mechanism outside of the current quid pro quo and therefore find a way to change the game's pathway by altering the decisions that a game master has made. That's really long-term problematic because it means that your faith in your game master or the person who's driving your story is called into question. All right, now this one is something that I haven't seen happen often, but when it does, it generally has to do with a player who's gotten their nose out of joint because a decision didn't go the way they want, in spite of everybody at the table agreeing with that decision. And they will endeavor in their turn or their action phase begin a filibuster by speaking about the decision that was made in character and try to make it about something that happened in the story so that they continue to kibitz and complain and get the rule change made by consensus. And a little bit like 12 Angry Men, I suppose, but the problem with a story break like this is that almost always it has no basis on the reality of the session, just the difficult situation that the player found themselves in, and now their ego is on the line. This one's not really so much of a problem as it is somewhat of an annoyance, so it goes into the rant category. Occasionally, a player will have an intent for humor. Now, all of us love jokes, all of us love fun in games, and the mechanistic balance between what is dramatic and what is humorous is often a very veiled or very thin line. But a person who is attempting to shoehorn humor is generally one who's already in a wordplay mindset and has a difficulty coming back to a more story-themed element. And I'm not referring to these people as being problematic, but they are difficult to deal with once you start them down that path. One of the biggest challenges, of course, is that as a game master, you can get involved with a humorous battle, dueling wits, and there's nothing wrong with some healthy wordplay back and forth. But there becomes a time when that needs to be curtailed and back to the action at hand, especially when you can see it on the face of other players. And the person who is shoehorning the humor sometimes doesn't have breaks. So how do you handle it at your table when a player has 3,000 jokes and doesn't want to stop until he's delivered all of them? What is it you do? I'd love to hear. All right, and the final one that I want to talk about is something that doesn't happen very often. As some of you know, I fundamentally made a rule so that players do not interact with other players in an adversarial way, simply to avoid the conflict that can happen when one player's opinion differs from another's. And what I'm referring to in this case is far beyond that. I'm speaking of a person who might have a personal challenge with another person at the table and therefore makes every issue into a conflict, puts pressure on each player to support their position aggressively, and fundamentally gets near to going to blows. Now, I've had only a few. In 50 years, I think I've had 3 situations that have actually come to actual fisticuffs and such. But this intentional PvP is provocation. It's players that are actually pushing for controversy that isn't in the story, isn't in the characters, but is between the players. And this has to be outlawed. And I'd like to hear how you guys handle such difficulties. In my case, I've actually gone to the point of actually asking someone to leave the table. I've actually engaged in situations where both people had to step away, and we had to actually have interventions in at least one case. So realize that these intentional PvPs are no longer really part of the game and are specifically a challenge between players that needs to be handled. All right, so I've gone through all of them relatively quickly. I'd love to hear your opinion. If there's some of the rants in here that I didn't include that you think should have been included, why don't you leave a comment down below and let us know. Let's get a conversation started. If you've got a way to resolve one or more of these, I'd love to hear from that as well. I want to thank you for being here. I'm Jonathan Albin at NycosRPG, and we do videos every day, so hope to see you in the next one. So let's play.